In the year 1969, American naval engineer Russell Humphreys decided to test an idea. He took the biblical dimensions of Noah's Ark and ran them through standard ship stability calculations. The result surprised him. The proportions described in the book of Genesis turned out to be practically identical to those used in modern shipbuilding for large cargo barges. Length to width, 6:1. This exact proportion is used today in the design of large transport vessels. The engineer built a mathematical model and discovered a structure with such characteristics is capable of withstanding waves up to 30 meters high without capsizing. This is the first mystery of the Ark. But there is a second, even more inconvenient one. If we try to reconstruct the internal organization of this structure, how it must have worked from the inside so that 8 people could sustain the lives of thousands of animals for nearly a year, we encounter engineering problems whose solution required knowledge that, according to conventional understanding, humanity acquired much later. Ventilation, water supply, waste removal, load distribution, feeding logistics. Each of these issues is a serious engineering problem in itself. Together they form a system of such complexity that its accidental and intuitive solution seems almost impossible. Today we will attempt to reconstruct this system, not from a theological, but from an engineering and historical perspective. How must this structure have been arranged to function at all? What laws of physics, biology, and mechanics made its operation possible? And what does the very description of the Ark in the text of Genesis tell us about the technical level of those who created it? We will rely on the biblical text itself, on research in the field of narrative exegesis, on the work of naval engineers who studied these questions, and on the basic laws of physics, which have not changed since the time of the flood. Let's start with the shape. Most depictions of Noah's Ark that have come down to us through cultural tradition, from medieval manuscripts to modern illustrated Bibles, portray it as a ship, with a pointed bow, a high stern, often with a mast. It is beautiful. It is familiar. And this, in the opinion of most researchers, is incorrect. The Hebrew word tevah, which is used in the book of Genesis to describe the Ark, is not the same word as onaya, ship. Tevah literally means box or chest. The same word is used in the book of Exodus to describe the woven basket in which Moses' mother placed the infant Moses. This is not a random coincidence. It is an indication of the shape, not the elongated and pointed hull of a ship, but a rectangular container. The biblical dimensions of the Ark: length, 300 cubits, width, 50 cubits, height, 30 cubits. A cubit in the ancient Hebrew tradition is about 45 centimeters, converting length approximately 135 meters, width 22.5 meters, height 13.5 meters, volume about 40,000 cubic meters. Now about the proportions. The length to width ratio is 6:1. This is not an arbitrary figure. It is precisely in the range of 6 to 7:1 that the proportions of the most efficient and stable vessels for operation in the open sea lie. A hull that is too wide is inefficient in terms of water resistance. One that is too narrow is unstable in a side wave. 6:1 is a compromise developed over millennia of practical shipbuilding. But the most important thing is this: the Ark had neither a rudder, nor sails, nor oars. No means of controlling direction. This is not an oversight by the designer. It is a conscious decision dictated by the task itself. A ship with nowhere to go does not need a rudder. It needs only one thing: not to capsize and not to sink. This is precisely why a rectangular hull proves optimal here. It possesses a property known in naval engineering as passive stability. When a wave heels such a hull to one side, its geometry creates a righting moment, a force that returns the structure to an upright position. The greater the heel, the stronger the righting force. In other words, such a vessel becomes harder to capsize the more one tries to capsize it. This is not a metaphor. It is mechanics. Modern specialists in naval architecture, having calculated the stability of the ark with the described parameters, concluded that to capsize the structure would require a wave with a side slope of more than 45 degrees. In practice, this means the ark could withstand sea conditions in which any normal ship would have long since gone to the bottom. Now, the next question. Wood is strong in compression, but poorly withstands bending loads distributed over a great length. A hull 135 meters long, made of wood, under certain conditions could break in the middle if the bow and stern sections were simultaneously on wave crests, while the middle section sagged between them. This is called hogging, and it is precisely what builders of large wooden vessels face. Here, one structural element mentioned in the book of Genesis without detail, but interpreted by researchers as key, is important. 3 decks. 3 horizontal tiers inside the hull. In modern shipbuilding, horizontal decks serve not only to divide space, they are load-bearing elements that connect the sides and prevent them from spreading apart under water pressure. Essentially, 3 decks transform the hull from a simple box into a rigid spatial structure. This is a standard engineering technique used in modern construction and shipbuilding. Only there, it is called stiffening diaphragms. Another material mentioned in the text is gopher, traditionally translated as gopher wood, although its precise identification in science remains debatable. A number of researchers propose the version that gopher is not a species of tree, but a method of processing wood, laminating or gluing thin layers with the grain at different angles. If so, then we have a description of a technology analogous to modern plywood, which possesses significantly greater bending strength than solid wood. This version remains hypothetical, but its engineering logic is impeccable. Outside and inside, the structure was covered with copher, pitch or bitumen. Waterproofing was ensured. But it is here that the next problem begins. When you seal a giant wooden box from the inside and outside, you create a sealed environment. And inside this environment are thousands of living beings that consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide. And something else. Let's talk about the atmosphere inside the ark. Thousands of animals, mammals, birds, reptiles, continuously exhale carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. It accumulates in the lower layers. At concentrations above 5%, it causes loss of consciousness. With further accumulation, death. Without constant air exchange, the animals on the lower tier would simply fall asleep and not wake up, before all the others. The next threat, methane. Thousands of tons of organic waste in a confined space is a powerful source of methane gas. Methane is not toxic at low concentrations, but it is explosive. When mixed with air in a proportion of 5 to 15%, it forms an explosive mixture. One source of open flame, a torch, an oil lamp, could cause a disaster.
And finally, ammonia. The urine of a large number of animals decomposes to release ammonia. In a confined space, the concentration of this gas very quickly reaches thresholds that destroy the mucous membranes of the respiratory tract. Solving all these problems simultaneously required a ventilation system that would work continuously, not require mechanical drive, and yet not allow outside water to flood inside. At first glance, an unsolvable task. But in the text of Genesis, there is a detail often overlooked. In the 6th chapter, Tsohar is mentioned, an opening that was to run along the upper perimeter of the structure, a cubit in width. Traditionally, this is translated as window or skylight. But the word Tsohar in the Hebrew text more likely means radiance, light from above, and its use here indicates a slit or gap running the entire length of the roof.
It is precisely this opening that is the key to the ventilation system. It works on the principle known in modern building physics as the stack effect or chimney effect. Thousands of living bodies release heat. Warm air is lighter than cold air. It rises upward. In a confined space, it collects at the ceiling and seeks an exit. If there is a gap along the entire upper perimeter, there is an exit. The heated air escapes through it to the outside. An area of low pressure is created behind it. It draws in fresh, cooler air from below through the same gaps or through special intake openings. The system works autonomously without any mechanical intervention as long as there is a temperature difference between the inside air and the outside. And this difference will always exist because thousands of warm bodies continuously produce heat. The more animals, the larger they are, the more intense the air exchange. The biological load becomes the engine of the ventilation system. The construction uses the animals themselves as a heat pump. This same system also solves the problem of explosive gases. Methane and ammonia leave with the rising currents of heated air. They do not accumulate to critical concentrations, provided the system works continuously. The condition of continuity is ensured by the construction itself. As long as the animals are alive, they heat the air. As long as the air is heated, it rises and escapes. As long as it escapes, fresh air comes to replace it. Now, about load distribution. In land-based construction, this is called a center of gravity problem. In naval terms, a stability problem. The meaning is the same. Cargo placed incorrectly can capsize the structure. The main rule, heavy cargo is placed as low as possible. This lowers the center of gravity of the entire vessel, which is physically equivalent to lengthening a pendulum. The longer the pendulum, the harder it is to displace from equilibrium.
Large animals, elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamuses, cattle, must have been on the lower tier. Not because it was better for them, it was worse. It was darker, more humid. All water and condensation drained there. But precisely their mass, concentrated in the lower part, created that very passive resistance to capsizing, which we call ballast. Living ballast. Several hundred tons of muscle mass pressed to the bottom in complete darkness, working as an anchor. But here a contradiction arises. We have just established that the animal's heat is necessary for ventilation, and that warm air must rise from bottom to top. If large animals are at the bottom, they produce heat at the bottom, it rises. All correct. The scheme works. But what happens physically to the animals on the lower tier? Under normal conditions, these animals move, are active. They need space. On the ship? No. Limited space and lack of stimuli for activity slow metabolism.
This is not a theoretical assumption. It is a documented
biological phenomenon. Mammals, under conditions of forced immobility, darkness, and lack of stimuli, reduce their metabolic rate. They eat less, drink less, produce less waste. This property of living organisms is directly opposite to what we usually expect from a complex logistical system. Usually, the greater the load, the more resources are required. Here, the opposite. Conditions that seem unbearable for normal life turn out to be optimal from the standpoint of resource consumption. Now, about feeding. 8 people, several thousand animals, about 370 days. This is a task at the sight of which most logistics specialists would simply say, impossible. Let's try to calculate. Taking a conservative estimate and assuming there were about 2,000 species of animals, 2 of each, a total of 4,000 animals.
Average food consumption per animal per day varies from grams for small reptiles to several tens of kilograms for large herbivores. If we assume, conditionally, 200 grams per animal on average, 4,000 animals consume 800 kilograms of food per day. Over 370 days, almost 300 tons, plus food for the people, plus water. How could the storage and distribution of such volumes be organized? The text of Genesis indicates that Noah took food with him in advance. Precisely this word, supplies, fodder supplies, stands in the text. This means the question of storage was part of the original plan. Where is food stored on a ship? On medium-sized vessels, on the middle tier, not by the water where it is damp and cold, and not by the upper deck where it is hot. The middle tier is the most stable zone in terms of temperature and humidity. It is there that organic materials store the longest. Grains, hay, dried fruits, seeds, all this can be preserved for a long time with proper storage. But proper storage in the conditions of a wooden hull with constant water outside requires airtight containers, clay vessels sealed with pitch, wooden boxes caulked from the inside. Precisely such solutions were used in ancient grain storage practices, and precisely such solutions are technically available in a system where pitch and bitumen are already the main building and sealing materials. But the main problem is not storage. The main problem is delivery. 8 people cannot physically carry hundreds of kilograms of feed across several decks 3 times a day. This is mathematically impossible. Even if each of the 8 worked 16 hours a day, the number of movements required to feed several thousand animals exceeds human physical capabilities. This means there must have been some system where gravity did most of the work for the people. This is where the 3-tier structure is important again. Food supplies are stored on the middle tier. Most large animals, consuming significant volumes of feed, are on the lower tier. The direction of food movement is downward, in favor of gravity. With the presence of chutes, pipes, or inclined channels connecting the middle tier storage to the lower tier feeders, the feeding process becomes flow management. Open a hatch, grain flows down by itself. Close the hatch, move to the next compartment. This is precisely the principle used in modern automatic feeding systems on farms, and it was quite feasible with wood, ropes, and simple wooden shutters. A similar principle applies to water. Rainwater is collected on the roof, the largest horizontal plane of the entire structure, with an area of several thousand square meters, directed by gutters into reservoirs on the upper or middle tier. From there, it flows by gravity down to watering troughs. The only necessity for manual labor is monitoring the level in the reservoirs and cleaning the channels. Water outside, salty, turbid, contaminated with decomposition products. It is undrinkable. Rainwater is the only source of fresh water. This is precisely why the Ark's roof, for all its structural simplicity, is a key technological element of the entire life support system. Now, about the most unpleasant part, about sanitation. Several thousand animals produce organic waste continuously, 24 hours a day. The accumulation of this waste is not just a hygiene problem, it is a threat to life. Ammonia from decomposing urine at concentrations of just a few hundred parts per million causes damage to the respiratory tract. At higher concentrations, blindness. The accumulation of organic mass increases the risk of infectious diseases, which spread at catastrophic speed in a confined space. At the same time, 8 people physically cannot manually remove waste in the volume it has produced. This means the waste removal system also had to work predominantly autonomously. Ancient animal husbandry practice knows the answer to this question. It is called a slatted floor, floors with gaps between the boards. Waste falls through the flooring down into a special tray or channel. The animals do not stand in their own waste. Odor is significantly reduced. But where does the waste from the tray go? On a normal farm, it is removed. On a ship, thrown overboard. Technically, this requires drainage channels with outlets in the side below the waterline, but with valves preventing water from flowing back in. Precisely such a system was used on ancient galleys to pump water from the bilge. Structurally, it is not complicated and quite feasible from wood. An additional factor, hull movement. In waves, the hull constantly heels from one side to the other. Liquid waste moves under the influence of this motion and drains to the lowest points where drainage holes are provided. The mechanical rocking of the waves, which creates discomfort for people and animals, simultaneously serves as a self-cleaning mechanism for the drainage system. The storm cleans up after itself. Now let's talk about the most complex aspect, the social and psychological arrangement of life inside the Ark. 8 people, confined space, the surrounding world destroyed, future unknown, closest relatives and acquaintances dead. Work does not stop for a day. More than 300 days without the possibility of going out for fresh air, without a horizon, without a change of scenery. These are conditions under which modern psychology predicts severe disorders. Sensory deprivation, isolation, monotony, grief, physical exhaustion. Any of these factors alone is a serious trial. Together they form ideal conditions for a psychological breakdown. What helped? Structure, routine, responsibility. When each day is scheduled with duties that must be performed, feeding, ventilation control, checking water levels in reservoirs, drainage, monitoring the condition of animals, there is practically no time for idleness and destructive thoughts. Routine becomes psychological protection. This is a documented phenomenon, well known to psychologists working with people in extreme, isolated conditions, at polar stations, on submarines, in long-term space missions. The book of Genesis describes a specific moment that can be interpreted as part of this psychological routine. Noah releases a raven, then a dove, at certain intervals, not because he doesn't know another way to check if there is land, but because it is a ritual, a repeating action with an expected result that structures time and gives a sense of control over the situation.
Perhaps this is why this episode is preserved in the text with such detail. 7 days, then another 7, then another 7.
Counting time was a way to preserve sanity. Now, about acoustics. This aspect is usually not mentioned in popular reconstructions of the Ark, although it is of fundamental importance. A wooden hull is an ideal resonator. Sound inside it is reflected multiple times from the walls, amplified, superimposed on itself. The roar of a large predator in a closed wooden space acquires the characteristics of an acoustic weapon. Animals that can neither escape nor attack the source of the sound react with panic. Panic of herbivores in a confined space is lethal. An animal trying to escape from the sound and having nowhere to run crashes into walls and partitions, breaks legs, crushes neighbors. Panic spreads like a wave. One frightened animal frightens its neighbor, that one the next, and within seconds the entire tier is gripped by madness. The only solution: separation into acoustic zones. Predators must be isolated so that their sounds do not reach the victims, or at least reach them sufficiently muffled. Thick partitions of several layers of wood reduce sound levels. Filled with organic material, hay, sawdust, they act as sound absorbers. Interestingly, the text of Genesis mentions cells or nests, from which one can infer precisely multi-layered partitions with filling, not simple plank partitions. Biologists note another factor that reduces the severity of this problem. Under conditions of chronic stress, darkness, and limited space, many animals eventually transition into a state that can be described as a passive stress response. They cease active reactions and switch to a mode of minimal functioning. This is not the same as hibernation, but it is similar. Reduced metabolism, inhibited reactions, minimal activity. In such a state, an animal not only eats less and makes less noise, it reacts much worse to sounds, perceiving them as neutral stimuli, not as threats. The dark, noisy ship becomes quiet after a few days. Now, the finale, the landing. After 150 days, the waters began to recede, then several more months. In the 7th month, the Ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. In Hebrew, Nuach, the same word as in Noah's name, meaning rest, stopping. Landing a structure of this size on solid ground is one of the most dangerous moments of the entire operation. The hull of a ship with a pointed bottom, when landing on uneven ground, immediately lies on its side. A flat-bottomed hull lands stably. This is another fundamental advantage of the rectangular shape. The mountains of Ararat, a volcanic mountain range in the east of modern Turkey, near the border with Armenia and Iran. The height of Greater Ararat is about 5,100 meters. The surface of the slopes, basalt and volcanic sedimentary rocks, covered in the wet period by a layer of liquefied soil. Precisely such a surface, wet, soft soil on a hard base, is the safest for landing a flat-bottomed vessel. It lands, sinks slightly into the ground, and remains stable. Several months after stopping, in the 10th month, the mountain peaks appeared. Noah opened the covering of the ark, the word miksa, covering, and looked around. Then he released a raven, then a dove, then waited another 7 days, released the dove again. It returned with an olive branch. Another 7 days, the dove flew away and did not return. The earth had dried. In the 601st year, on the first day of the first month, he removed the covering. On the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. They came out.
Total time in the Ark, 378 days, more than a year. What emerged was not a rested, strengthened expedition.
It was 8 people, physically exhausted by monotonous hard labor, psychologically deformed by isolation and the experienced catastrophe. Before them, a world without roads, without cities, without familiar landmarks, covered with a layer of dried silt and the debris of what was civilization. From the standpoint of the engineering analysis we have conducted, the following is evident. The structure of the ark described in the book of Genesis is not accidental. Its parameters correspond to the optimal ones for the task it was meant to solve. The shape, a rectangular hull with a 6:1 proportion, is optimal for passive stability. The 3-tier structure solves 3 problems simultaneously: the load-bearing structure of the hull, separation of animals by species and needs, load distribution. The ventilation system, based on thermal draft, uses the biological load itself as the driving force. Gravitational distribution of feed and water from top to bottom allows 8 people to service a system of such complexity. The drainage system, using the ship's rocking for self-cleaning, solves the sanitation problem without additional labor. This is not a description of a randomly assembled wooden box. This is a description of an integrated engineering system in which individual elements solve several tasks simultaneously, using as driving forces only what is available without external energy sources: gravity, the heat of living bodies, the mechanical motion of waves, precipitation. Could such a system be created without knowledge of physical laws in their formal mathematical expression? Yes. An experienced builder and animal husbander, possessing extensive practical knowledge and common sense, is capable of arriving at correct solutions through observation and experiment, without textbooks on hydrostatics. This is perhaps the most curious aspect of this entire story. Not a miracle in the sense of violating the laws of nature, but precise adherence to these laws under conditions where the price of error was absolute. As for historical and archaeological aspects, the picture here is more complex. Searches for the remains of the Ark on Ararat have been conducted since the 19th century. Various expeditions have reported the discovery of ancient wooden structures at high altitudes, but none of these finds have been verified with a sufficient degree of scientific rigor. Climatic conditions on Ararat, glaciers, seismic activity, temperature fluctuations, do not favor the preservation of wooden structures over millennia. Most specialists in biblical archaeology view these searches with skepticism. A separate scientific question concerns the connection between Near Eastern flood narratives. The story of a global flood and a large ark is present not only in the book of Genesis. It exists in the Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest written texts in human history. There, the ark is called the Boat of Utnapishtim, and its description has a number of striking similarities with the biblical one: warning of the flood, construction of a large vessel, loading of animals, sending out a scout bird, landing on a mountain. Researchers debate the nature of this similarity, whether it is a common historical memory of a real catastrophic event, literary borrowing, or parallel development of mythological motifs. None of these versions has yet been accepted as definitive. Geologists record traces of several major flood events in the region of the Black and Caspian Seas from 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. In particular, the hypothesis of a breach of the Bosporus, which could have led to the rapid flooding of a large part of the coastal lowland around the Black Sea, has been repeatedly discussed in scientific literature. Whether this was that catastrophe remains an open question. What remains stable, regardless of these debates, is the engineering question. Humanity in deep antiquity possessed significant practical knowledge in the fields of construction, navigation, and animal husbandry. The reconstruction of the internal logic of the Ark shows that the task set for it by the text was complex but fundamentally solvable, using technologies available in the pre-industrial era. As with many other monuments of ancient engineering, pyramids, aqueducts, Minoan palaces with their plumbing systems, Cretan storage complexes with gravitational cooling, what is striking is not that these structures existed, but how well their creators understood the physics they applied. They did not know formulas, but they knew how water, air, wood, and living bodies work. And that was enough. Perhaps this is the most interesting lesson of the Ark's history. Not about the flood, not about the animals, and not about the 8 survivors, but about the fact that engineering knowledge is older than we are accustomed to think, and that a person faced with the task of survival finds solutions that millennia later will be rediscovered as laws of science. Let us return to details that warrant deeper examination. The question of exactly how many animals should have been on board, and how this relates to the actual dimensions of the structure. This is one of the most frequently raised questions in any discussion about the Ark, and, as often happens, framing the question correctly changes the answer. A common objection is phrased like this: there are millions of biological species on Earth. How could all of them be accommodated on one vessel, even a very large one? But this objection is based on several assumptions that are worth examining. First, that the word kind in the biblical text corresponds to the modern scientific concept of a biological species. This is not the case. The Hebrew word min, used in the book of Genesis, is closer to the concept of genus or basic type, a broader category. If Noah took a pair of animals from each min, an ancestor from which several modern species later descended, the number of animals on board would be significantly smaller. Consider an example. The feline family today includes over 30 species: lion, tiger, cheetah, jaguar, puma, lynx, snow leopard, and dozens of smaller ones. If the min for cats is one ancestral type, only one pair was needed on board. According to modern estimates by a number of researchers, the total number of mins of land animals requiring salvation could range from several hundred to several thousand, not millions. Second assumption: that all insects, amphibians, and marine animals also had to be taken aboard, but the text explicitly speaks only of air-breathing animals, everything in which there is the breath of life. Fish do not drown in a flood. Most insects and invertebrates can survive in water or on floating debris. Amphibians are creatures of 2 environments. If we accept a narrower definition, only land-dwelling, air-breathing vertebrates, the number of mins fits quite comfortably into the available volume of the Ark. Let us do a simple estimate: 40,000 cubic meters of volume. Even if we assume 8,000 animals, each would have an average of 5 cubic meters, a rectangle roughly 1.5 meters by 1.5 meters by 2 meters. For most animals of average size, this is quite sufficient, considering that smaller animals occupy significantly less space. 1/3 of the volume is allocated for food supplies, water, drainage systems, passageways, and living space for the people.
This is not proof that everything happened exactly this way.
It demonstrates that the task is fundamentally solvable under reasonable assumptions. Let us move to another frequently asked question about wooden structures of such scale in antiquity. An ark 135 meters long would be the largest wooden vessel ever built. For comparison, the largest wooden sailing ships of the European maritime era, the line ships of the 18th and 19th centuries, reached about 60 meters in length. Chinese junks historically were somewhat larger. The longest documented wooden vessel, the American warship Durandal of the mid-19th century, was about 90 meters. But it also suffered from hull twisting and required constant maintenance. 135 meters in wood is very close to the physical limit for a wooden ship hull. Wood fibers cannot withstand the longitudinal stresses that arise at such length under sea wave conditions. This is why the largest wooden vessels in history invariably suffered from problems with longitudinal bending strength. Does this mean an ark of such dimensions could not exist? Not necessarily, for several reasons. First, the ark was not a sailing vessel. Its hull did not bear the loads associated with steering and maneuvering, which sharply increase twisting stresses. A passive structure, simply floating in the water, experiences significantly lower loads than a vessel that actively works sails, rudder, and engine. Second, the three-tier internal structure with horizontal decks, which we discussed in the context of stability, simultaneously solves the problem of longitudinal bending. Horizontal beams connecting the sides prevent the hull from bending along its length. This is what, in modern construction, is called a rigid frame. Third, and this is purely a hypothetical version, if the word gopher indeed denotes a special method of processing and gluing wood, then the resulting material could possess significantly higher bending strength than ordinary logs. Glued laminated timber constructions made from several layers with cross-grained fibers are one of the strongest building materials ever invented by humans, and it is made from wood. Now let us discuss an aspect rarely considered in such reconstructions: light. 17 centimeters. This is the calculated width of the Zohar gap. If 1 cubit equals approximately 45 centimeters, and the width of the Zohar is 1 cubit. However, researchers point out that in the ancient Hebrew text, 1 cubit for the Zohar may not mean the width of the gap, but the height of the space beneath it, meaning a ventilation cornice 1 cubit high running along the entire perimeter below the roofline. In that case, the total area of the ventilation opening was significantly larger. Regardless, from the perspective of lighting, the only source of daylight inside is this strip at the top. On clear days, diffuse light penetrates through it. During a storm, no. In bad weather, almost complete darkness. This means that life inside the ark was determined by the change of days, not through sight, but through other senses. The sound of rain, whether it is falling or not. The movement of the hull, whether the waves are active or calm. The air temperature, whether it is cooled or warmed. People who live long in conditions of limited lighting develop higher sensitivity to non-optical signals from the environment. This is documented in studies of polar winterers. Interestingly, in the book of Genesis, time inside the ark is measured not by visual observations, but by counting days. 40 days and 40 nights. 150 days. In the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month. This is not observing the sky. It is keeping records, counting, a method of marking the passage of time independent of what is visible outside. This indirectly indicates literacy, or at least a system of counting that Noah used to keep records inside the ark. Let us return to the topic of nutrition and consider one practical question: how to feed predators. Modern practice of keeping predators in zoos involves live or fresh food. On a ship, with a voyage duration of over a year, live food would quickly run out. Here are several biological observations with practical significance. First, large predators, cats, bears, dogs, tolerate prolonged fasting significantly better than herbivores. A lion in the wild can go without eating for several weeks. Under conditions of reduced activity, darkness, and cold, its need for food decreases further. Second, dried meat, fish, products that can be prepared beforehand and store well, are acceptable food for most carnivorous animals. We have no grounds to assume that predators necessarily had to eat exclusively live prey. Third, with a sufficiently severe reduction in metabolism under conditions of limited activity, predators' need for high-calorie food significantly decreases. A number of researchers in zoology suggest that under such conditions, unusually long fasting would become biologically possible, even for species that normally eat every few days. None of these versions is 100% proven for the specific situation, but all indicate that the task of feeding predators, despite its complexity, is not fundamentally insoluble. Let us now turn to the broader historical context. What we know about large-scale wooden construction in the prehistoric period. Large-scale wooden structures are much older than commonly thought. Göbekli Tepe in modern Turkey, one of the oldest religious complexes discovered by humanity, dates to approximately 12,000 years BCE. Its builders clearly possessed skills for organized construction on a huge scale, and did this millennia before what is commonly called civilization emerged. Wooden structures of Neolithic Europe, pile dwellings on the shores of alpine lakes in Switzerland, Germany, Austria, demonstrate a high level of carpentry skill, specialization of labor, use of specialized tools, work with large wooden beams, waterproofing. Megalithic cultures, the builders of Stonehenge, Karnak, Maltese temples, organized the movement of stone blocks weighing tens of tons over distances of hundreds of kilometers. Logistics of such scale required managerial abilities comparable to those needed for building a large vessel. All this indicates that the practical engineering capabilities of people in the period to which most researchers date the events described in the book of Genesis were significantly higher than often assumed in popular historical accounts. Now let us turn to the question of the nature of the flood itself, what we know from geological sources. This is important because the character of the flood directly influences the assessment of engineering requirements for the ark. If the flood was global, covering all land on the planet, the engineering requirements are one thing. If it was regional, albeit catastrophic in scale for those who experienced it, the requirements are different. The geological record contains traces of several large flood events in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. Two regions are studied most thoroughly. First, the Black Sea Basin. According to several hypotheses, around 8,000 years BCE, due to the breakthrough of a natural barrier through the Bosporus, waters of the Mediterranean Sea rushed into the enclosed freshwater basin. The flooded area, several 100,000 square kilometers. The water level rose rapidly, according to some estimates, several centimeters per day. People living on the shores of this inland freshwater lake faced a catastrophe spreading faster than they could flee. Second region, the Indus River Valley and the Mesopotamian lowland. Here, catastrophic flood layers are recorded, dating to different periods from 5,000 to 8,000 years ago. British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, during excavations at Ur, discovered a layer of alluvial deposits without any artifacts, separating two cultural layers. He interpreted this as evidence of a flood. Subsequently, this interpretation was challenged, but the layer itself is real. None of these events is a proven candidate for the role of the, quote, biblical flood. And this is quite natural. If events occurred 7,000 to 10,000 years ago, corresponding geological evidence is largely lost or altered by subsequent geological processes. What is important from an engineering perspective, for survival in conditions of a regional catastrophic flood covering the Middle East or a significant part of it, the structure described in Genesis would be quite adequate. The structure did not need to be capable of crossing the Pacific Ocean. It needed to survive in conditions of an extreme flood on a relatively limited body of water. In this context, the construction task becomes less fantastical and more concrete. Not a vessel for ocean sailing, but a floating protected object for long-term waiting for floodwaters to subside. This also changes the assessment of the engineering solution. It is no less impressive, but it is more realistic. Let us summarize our engineering investigation. We examined 7 key technical aspects of the Ark, based on the text of Genesis and basic laws of physics. First, hull shape. A rectangular box with a 6:1 proportion, not a sign of primitiveness. It is an optimal solution for passive stability, confirmed by modern marine engineering. Second, internal structure. 3 tiers perform several functions simultaneously: a load-bearing frame against longitudinal bending, separation of animals, optimal load distribution. Third, ventilation. The Zohar gap along the perimeter of the roof creates a passive draft effect, using animal heat as a pump. An autonomous system requiring no mechanical drive. Fourth, load distribution. Heavy animals on the lower tier, ballast providing stability. Their state of forced passivity reduces resource consumption. Fifth, feeding logistics. Gravity troughs from the middle tier to the lower allow 8 people to service thousands of animals without physically impossible loads. Sixth, water supply. Rainwater from the roof, the only source of fresh water. Gravity fed from top to bottom. Seventh, sanitation. Slatted floors plus drainage channels plus wave-induced rocking create a self-cleaning system requiring no manual labor. All these solutions share one trait. They utilize existing forces: gravity, heat, wave motion, biological properties of animals, instead of fighting them. This is a sign not of a naive builder, but of an experienced engineer who understands, in survival conditions, the system must work by itself, not require constant intervention. The story of the Ark, examined from this perspective, turns out not to be a story of miraculous salvation contrary to physics. It turns out to be a story of how humans can solve a task of extreme complexity if they correctly use the laws of nature that already exist, and that will not disappear no matter how many thousands of years pass. There is another aspect of this topic that invariably attracts attention and warrants separate consideration: the question of exactly where the Ark was located after the flood and what became of it. The book of Genesis indicates the mountains of Ararat. In tradition dating from deep antiquity, this name correlates with a mountain range in eastern modern Turkey, near the border of Armenia and Iran. Armenian historical tradition associates the initial settlement of these lands precisely with Noah's descendants. The name Armenia itself, in several etymological versions, is traced to the name of Noah's grandson, Aram. Search for the Ark on Ararat has been conducted since the mid-19th century. In 1848, German geologist Friedrich Parrot, who made the first ascent of Greater Ararat, described glacial moraines on the upper part of the mountain, but found no wooden structures. In the 20th century, several expeditions reported seeing wooden structures at altitudes from 4,000 to 5,000 meters. The most famous such story is the account of pilot Vladimir Roskovitsky, who in 1917, according to several publications, saw from an airplane a large wooden structure on the slope of Ararat. This story was actively reproduced in religious and popular literature, but its reliability was never documented. In the 1970s to 1990s, several American and European expeditions worked on Ararat using aerial photography and radar scanning of glaciers. Results were ambiguous. Some anomalies on images were interpreted as possible traces of a large wooden structure, but convincing evidence was not obtained. In 2010, a group of researchers from Hong Kong reported discovering wooden structures at an altitude of about 4,000 meters. Rock samples were sent for radiocarbon analysis, results dating the wood to approximately 5,000 years BCE. However, this find also did not undergo independent verification, and most specialists received it with caution. The problem of preservation of organic material on Ararat is extremely serious. Glacial movement, periodic seismic events. Ararat is located in a seismically active zone. Extreme temperature and humidity fluctuations. Wood under such conditions deteriorates over centuries, not to mention millennia. Therefore, the absence of reliably verified remains of the Ark is not a decisive argument, either for or against its existence. Let us move to a question that is more strictly historically verifiable. Parallel flood narratives in cultures of the Middle East. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest texts in the history of human writing, recorded on clay tablets and dating to approximately the 2nd millennium BCE, contains a detailed account of a flood. The hero, Utnapishtim, receives from the god Ea a warning of a coming flood and instructions for building a large vessel. He loads onto it the seed of all living things, enters himself with his family and craftsmen. The flood lasts 7 days. The vessel lands on Mount Nisir. Utnapishtim releases a dove, then a swallow, then a crow. The similarity with the biblical narrative is so detailed that the question of their relationship became one of the central ones in Near Eastern philology of the 19th, 20th centuries. When in 1872, British Assyriologist George Smith read the flood episode from Gilgamesh at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London, the sensation was so great that Smith received sponsorship for an expedition to Nineveh to search for missing fragments. Today, in Near Eastern literature, over 200 versions of flood narratives from different cultures and regions are known. This is not only the Middle East. Similar legends of a global flood exist in Indian, Chinese, Greek, Mayan, Aztec, Polynesian traditions. None of these versions coincides with another in details, but all share a structural core: a world catastrophe of water, a chosen survivor, salvation on a floating structure, renewal of life. What does this mean for a historian? At minimum, that the memory of some large catastrophic flood event was powerful enough to survive in the oral tradition of many peoples over millennia and ultimately be recorded in written texts of diverse cultures.
Whether it concerns the same event or several independent local catastrophes that generated similar narratives is an open question. But the wide distribution of the flood theme itself is a historical fact. Within our engineering investigation, this has one specific consequence. The Sumerian version describes a vessel with different proportions than the biblical one. According to the description, Utnapishtim's vessel was almost cubic, approximately equal length, width, and height. From a marine engineering perspective, a cubic vessel is significantly less stable than a rectangular one with a 6:1 proportion. This difference is interesting. It indicates that the authors of the biblical text either changed the proportions intentionally, or described a different object, or possessed better knowledge of marine architecture. But of course, in this topic, one cannot fail to mention another question that often arises in conversations about the ark. What happened to the animals after disembarking onto land? This is not an engineering question, but a biological and ecological one. If the ark landed in the region of the Araxes or in the mountains of Ararat, this is a harsh mountain environment with limited food resources. How did thousands of animals of different species disperse across the entire planet from one point? From the perspective of modern biology, this is a separate, complex task, solved differently by proponents of different positions. Some appeal to a post-flood landscape with substantially different climatic conditions. Others point out that over thousands of years, this dispersal is quite realistic, with natural reproduction. Third suggests that not all species disembarked from one point, that it concerns a regional catastrophe, and most animals outside the flood zone continued living in their territories. This is honest scientific debate, and each position has its arguments. Within our investigation, we do not attempt to resolve it. This leads us too far from the original question of how the structure worked from inside. But precisely here, drawing a conclusion, it is important to speak about what, in fact, struck us most in this story. Not the scale. The scale is grand, but large-scale construction projects in antiquity are known. Pyramids, megaliths, aqueducts. Not the duration. Almost a year of sailing. This is long, but human physiology copes with it. What is striking is the systemic integrity. Every technical solution we examined in this investigation was not merely an answer to one specific problem. Each solved several tasks simultaneously and was organically connected with other solutions. Rectangular shape, stability, and simplicity of construction. 3 tiers: hull strength, load sorting, logistics. Heavy animals at the bottom, ballast plus thermal draft. Gap at the top, ventilation plus lighting. Supplies in the middle, optimal storage temperature plus gravity delivery. Slatted floors plus rocking, sanitation without labor. Roof, water collection plus protection from bad weather. No solution worked in isolation. All were part of a unified design in which each element strengthened the system as a whole. This is precisely what is called engineering elegance, when a system works because all its parts are coordinated, not because each of them individually is sufficiently powerful. Millennia later, this property, systemic elegance, remains one of the highest standards in engineering. The best mechanism is not the strongest one, but the smartest one. The Ark, if judged by its textual description and the engineering logic of that description, was precisely such.